When we write code on our computers, we want to make sure that our teammates or other dependents can utilize our code by having them available in a centralized place. Similarly, with our Docker images, we want to have a centralized place where we can store, manage, and version the Docker images so that they can be pulled into different applications.
So let's take a step back and think about our typical workflow with Git. We typically have a Git repository that is a centralized source for our code. We could push changes to the code, and when other people need to use the latest code, they can pull it down from the repository where you had pushed the changes. Conceptually, we can imagine a container registry to function very similarly. Rather than pushing code changes through, we're actually pushing Docker images. This helps us tie together our overall picture of the Docker development workflow. We have our application code, which gets built into a Docker image using a Docker file, and then the Docker image gets pushed to a container registry where our image is versioned and made available for others. And then the Docker images can be used to run containers. I'm going to briefly run through what a container registry named Docker Hub looks like. So Docker Hub is a great tool for us to help manage our images. And here on the top, there's a search bar, and I just want to demonstrate how it's similar to GitHub where we can explore other content. So if I type in Node here and search for it, we can see that there's a project named Node.js. And this is actually what we're using to build our Node.js projects. And you can see that there's this long list of all these versions that are available to help us manage our dependencies. Specifically for us, let's start with creating a repository where we can have our Docker images live in. So let's create something called simple node that can house the Docker images that we've been building. Great. And there's some configurations here. For our exercise, we're going to be using a public repository. And we can link this with our GitHub or Bitbucket account, but we're not going to worry about that for now. Once we do that, we should have this repository set up in our Docker registry. What we're going to do now is that we're going to take that code and push it into this repository. In our development environment, we have these Docker images, and I want to take this simple node project and put it into Docker Hub. What I can do is that I can do something to tag it. I want this simple node Docker image to be registered as something that's going to be using this repository that I had just created in Docker Hub. So what this does is that this associates the name of my Docker container registry with my Docker image. And prior to being able to do anything, I'm actually going to have to run this command to log into my container registry so that I have the proper permissions to push that in there. For you, you'll probably have to run this command on your machine, but I ran it ahead of time because I don't want to go back and forth with copying my password into my command line for obvious reasons. So let's say that we've run this command, which I've done already, and I can run the command for docker push. What this command is going to do is that it's going to take that image that I've tagged here and push it into a container registry. So if I do this, it's going to take its time and prepare that image in Docker Hub. In the build and deploy process, building Docker images can take up most of the time. One strategy to reduce build times is to utilize a base image. This reduces redundant operations that might stay the same across multiple builds. We essentially take steps in our Docker build process that are always repeated and store them as a base image. Let's explore this concept by looking at our Docker file. Inside this Docker file, we have some configurations that set up how we want to build our Docker image. Most importantly, above here, you can see that we're using something called from node 13. So what's happening is that since we know we're always going to install Node.js, we opt to use the Node.js base image for our project rather than a bare bones Linux base image and install Node.js every time. This way, whenever we run Docker build, we don't have to wait for all the Node.js dependencies to install and hang. So rather than using Node, we can use our own Docker image that we pushed to Docker Hub earlier in the lesson. And then that existing project will become a static building block that's used for other applications.